Buon pomeriggio a tutti.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today, we have, I would say, the grace of having with us a great friend, Carl Anderson. Mr. Anderson got his degree in philosophy in Seattle, Washington, and then in law at Denver, Colorado. He was a crucial figure in founding the Family Center of John Paul II in Washington, D.C., and from the year 2000, he is the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus. And he has written a book, Civilization of Love, everything that a Catholic can do to transform the world. But especially, as I said at the beginning, he's a friend. He's a friend of ours. He's a friend of Julian Carron. And therefore, it was great warmth and interest that we are here to hear him talk about this great movement in America. The floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be with you today. Pope John Paul II used to speak about a new springtime of the gospel. And the work of Don Giussani is one of the great fruits of this springtime. And so it is a pleasure and a privilege for me to be with you and to contribute in some small way to the success of this meeting. 2 years ago, Pope Benedict invited us to live out our hope with works of charity, because hope, like faith, is demonstrated in love. That love of neighbor, which expresses both faith and hope, is also the story of the Knights of Columbus. When our founder, the venerable servant of God, Michael McGivney, founded the Knights of Columbus in 1882, he did so as a pastor concerned about the welfare of the most marginalized people. Widows and orphans in 19th century America did not have a social safety net. If the father, the breadwinner, died, his wife and children faced a life of poverty and the likely breakup of their family, as children would be divided up among relatives able to support them, or worse, the children were handed over to institutions of the state for their care. And to make matters worse, in a state like Connecticut, where the Knights of Columbus was founded, there was a deep anti-Catholicism that discriminated against the Catholic immigrants of that time. But the problem wasn't just an abstraction to Father McGivney. It was something he dealt with personally. And I think that in any discussion of charity, the personal component, the encounter between us and Christ in the distressing disguise of the marginalized, if I may paraphrase Mother Teresa, is more compelling than statistics. Father McGivney knew firsthand when in early 1882 he put up the money necessary to save a family and to help a teenager named Alfred Downs. The boy's father had died and left the widow and children in poverty. Only Father McGivney's help saved the young boy, Alfred, from being taken from his mother and put in a state institution. Faced with such personal experiences, we can see why this priest was the same man who later that same year would formally establish an organization to help widows and orphans, the Knights of Columbus. Father McGivney had several goals in the foundation of this organization. First and foremost was the protection of the spiritual and temporal welfare of his parishioners. Spiritually, the men of his parish they needed a group of Catholic men, a network of faithful Catholics with whom they could associate and have their faith strengthened. And McGivney knew that many of his parishioners were tempted to join other fraternal society, some of which were anti-Catholic. So Father McGivney saw the Knights of Columbus as an authentic response to help in a concrete way the problems of Catholic men and their families. So in a very real way, the Knights were organized to protect the integrity of Catholic family life and some of the most vulnerable and marginalized people in society, widows and orphans. The Knights are a living example of what Pope Benedict referred to in his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, when he wrote, "The parable of the Good Samaritan offers two particularly important contributions. Until that time, the concept of neighbor was understood as referring essentially to one's countrymen and to foreigners who had settled in the land of Israel. In other words, the Pope writes, to the closely knit community of a single country or people. This limit is now abolished by Christ. Anyone who needs me, anyone who I can help, is my neighbor." In addition, in choosing the name Knights of Columbus, this was not an accident. Columbus was chosen as our patron precisely because he was one of the only Catholics popularly thought as a hero in America at the time. And we chose to link our organization to a patriotic hero to emphasize the fact that a man could be a good patriot and a good Catholic. He could be both Catholic and a good American citizen. As a group committed to the spiritual and temporal welfare of its members, the Knights of Columbus had at its founding the principles of charity, unity, and fraternity. It was the principle of charity, the first principle of the Knights of Columbus, which was to become our most defining characteristic. Knights started by helping their parish priests, like Father McGivney. They collected money for the families of deceased members, a process that would soon grow into a very successful life insurance company in the United States. And from these humble, small beginnings, the charitable strength of the Knights of Columbus grew. Later, when Catholics from Ireland and from Italy were marginalized and discriminated against by American immigration laws that sought to exclude them, the Knights of Columbus stood up and publicly attacked this bigotry to have equality for immigrants from Catholic countries. When there was a lack of accommodation for the spiritual welfare of Catholic soldiers in the First World War, the Knights of Columbus stepped forward to correct the situation. We set up centers for Catholic soldiers so that they would not have to attend Protestant centers where there was proselytizing to abandon their Catholic faith. And when the Knights established our program, it was under the slogan, "Everybody welcome, everything free," as a witness to what authentic Christian charity is all about. In fact, although racial tolerance, let alone racial equality, was to be decades away in the United States, the Knights of Columbus was applauded after the First World War because our programs did not discriminate against Black Americans. And on a spiritual level, the Knights of Columbus provided Catholic chaplains to our troops, supplementing those provided by the Army. In fact, there were more than 50 Catholic chaplains sponsored by the Knights of Columbus. And these brave priests sacrificed a great deal. And many of them were killed or wounded during the war, including Father William Davitt of Massachusetts, who was the last American to die in the First World War on November 11th, 1918, the day the war ended. After the First World War, peacetime presented many different challenges. And after the war, the Knights of Columbus continued our work for charity by providing job training and assistance to the troops as they were coming home. And during this time, the Vatican asked us to begin charitable work in Rome. And in 1920, the Knights began charitable work for sports athletic fields in Rome, where we had 5 athletic fields for the poor children of Rome that were offered at no charge. One of the marginalized groups in American society that Knights of Columbus began to work with very closely in the 1960s was the intellectually disabled. From the very beginning, we began working with the Special Olympics more than 40 years ago, when this organization was founded by the late Eunice Kennedy Shriver and her husband, who was a member of the Knights of Columbus, Sergeant Shriver. And this work continues today. We also work to build a culture of life in the challenge of abortion. We were one of the first organizations in the United States to found and support the pro-life movement back in the 1970s. But what we found in our fight against abortion is that the pro-life movement cannot be one-dimensional. And that is why the Knights of Columbus always work to support mothers who choose life. We are working with the Sisters of Life, a new religious congregation founded by Cardinal John O'Connor of New York. And we have sponsored a new center for help of unwed mothers and women with crisis pregnancies called Villa Maria Guadalupe. And we have worked to help the pain of parents, both the mother and the father, who have participated in the abortion of their children. Today, 127 years after our founding in Connecticut,
7 anni dopo la nostra fondazione nel Connecticut,
our ability to practice our principle of charity
il principio di carità
has grown tremendously.
tremendamente.
Last year alone, the Knights of Columbus
I Cavalieri di Colombo
donated $150 million to charity and provided 68 million hours of volunteer service to charitable programs. For example, now we are providing ultrasound machines to crisis pregnancy centers so that they can help a woman see the life of her unborn child. And help her to choose life for that child. We know that 90% of the women who consider abortion, once they see their unborn child, choose life for their baby. So the simple idea of an ultrasound machine for these women can save thousands of lives for only a few dollars. We have also grown into a successful insurance company. And we try to operate this company according to Catholic principles. And to run our business based on the social doctrine of the Church. So we try to treat our customers and employees fairly. And our investment rules prevent us from investing in companies that violate Catholic teaching regarding abortion or embryonic stem cell research or contraception or pornography. And yet our investment department consistently does better than the Standard & Poor's 500 or the Russell 1000 averages on the stock exchange. So one can actually be a good Catholic businessman and be a successful Catholic businessman. And this is the great service now that Pope Benedict has done for us this year with his encyclical. Because he has laid a foundation to reestablish a moral way of doing business. And it is the responsibility of Catholic businessmen to demonstrate that the Church's teaching is true. I think it is important for us to insist as employers, employees, investors, consumers, that businesses have a firm moral compass and that they operate on an ethical level. And first, we should insist that our ethics are consistent throughout our life, whether we are at home, at church, or at work. And we should settle for nothing less than ethical behavior from those who work for us. And secondly, we should invest our money and which companies we choose to work with in an ethical manner. As we face the worst economic crisis of our lifetime, we should remember that the worst of human nature, greed, has been diagnosed as responsible for this crisis. And many lost sight of the importance of unity, of communion with our neighbors as part of the solution. A business model based upon our understanding of the dignity of each person and on our responsibility to our neighbor cannot help but be an ethical one. We must take the Good Samaritan's example in every aspect of our lives, and especially in our business relationships. Only in this way, and the Pope makes this very clear in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, that business development will be sustainable over time. It is also important for us to witness to other organizations on the good that can be done in service to our neighbor. This past year, we were able to organize a summit on volunteerism as a response to the economic crisis in the United States. We were able to share and have others share the good that we are able to do in our communities when many organizations come together. In each of these cases and in so many other ways, what we are able to do for those most in need can be demonstrated whether that need is temporary, long-term, or permanent. I believe that Catholics and Catholic organizations and movements have an excellent opportunity and the responsibility to reach out both to other Catholics and to the world at large in a witness of charity. As Christians, Christ has called us to be known by the way we love one another. And leadership in this dimension can be the greatest force for good. This type of cooperation, or if you will, communion, within the church and with organizations outside the church who are striving to do good is, I believe, the preeminent model for Catholic movements as they seek to transform the world by encouraging people to say yes to Jesus Christ. And nowhere is the face of our church more attractive than in our open embrace of our neighbor. Each encounter with those in need is actually an opportunity to create a civilization of love, one person at a time. But sometimes statistics and the sheer volume of good works can make the practical effects hard to realize. What makes an organization like ours work and keep working for 127 years is the effect of each event, each encounter between a member and his or her neighbor. both are changed, but the change for the one giving help is often more profound than the change for the one receiving help. As Pope Benedict reminds us, it's not the millions of dollars and hours donated, it's not the number of projects. It's not really about numbers at all. It's about saying yes to Jesus Christ in service to our neighbor. It's seeing the face of Christ in the face of each person who needs our help. A couple of years ago, I was in Mexico City to help with a distribution of wheelchairs to the handicapped of that city who were too poor to buy their own. And the experience of giving this mobility to a person who previously had to drag himself or herself across concrete and dirt is really indescribable. And the contribution to the dignity of the person that you have helped support is inescapable. One of the people I gave a wheelchair to was a young girl named Funny. She later wrote a letter to me in which she called the Knights of Columbus her precious treasure and her angels. As my wife Doreen and I lifted her into her chair, our gift of support of her dignity was clear. But she was our precious treasure, and she truly was an angel for us. It is more blessed to give than to receive, because in giving we receive so much more. And one of the things we receive is that even though she lives in Mexico City and we live in Connecticut, that day and ever since we have been neighbors. This is the sort of experience our members have millions of times each year as they reach out to their neighbor in service. Our members, through their faith and work together for their neighbors, actively underscore Pope Benedict's words that communion always and inseparably has both a vertical and a horizontal sense. It is communion with God and communion with our brothers and sisters. If we take our two principles in the Knights of Columbus, unity, that communion we have with each other, within our parish, within our neighborhoods, and within our church, and in these ways with God Himself. And our second principle of charity, where we encounter Christ by giving of ourselves together with our brother knights. Not only do we encounter Christ in those we help, we also further strengthen our unity, and in this way provide our members with a strong formation in community through works of charity. The experience of our charitable work makes clear what Pope Benedict wrote when he said, "There is no ordering of the state so just that it can eliminate the need for a service of love. Whoever wants to eliminate love is preparing to eliminate man as such. There will always be suffering, which cries out for consolation and help. There will always be loneliness There will always be situations of material need where help in the form of concrete love of neighbor is indispensable. Our members, seeing Christ in their neighbor and seeking communion with him, are thus active in what the Pope has emphasized as charity in truth, an authentic gift of self that goes beyond the mere social work that can be done by a state. Fortified by the Eucharist and in communion with the Church, our charity brings us into communion with Christ in his various distressing disguises. It is faith in action, concretely and not abstractly. And through this action we encounter Christ himself in the form of those seen as the least of our neighbors. Our understanding of what it means to participate in the Christian event, the event of Christ, is thus contextualized in our work of charity. Charity is as indispensable for those of us giving as it is for those who receive. For each charitable act speaks the very language of faith and hope. And each time that language is spoken, it helps to build up the civilization of love. Thank you very much.
Abbiamo del tempo per...
We have time for questions. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, 2 or 3 questions. First of all, if I'm not mistaken, in the US, there isn't really Catholics or the Knights of Columbus are very numerous. There's no Catholic body more numerous than the Knights of... there's no... You getting a translation? Okay. Are there the Knights of the Knights of Columbus? In fact, are very numerous. There's no other association which is as numerous, right? Well, in fact, this is in fact what you said now. And there's a big question there that I have, which is something that you see today in our culture, which is increasingly the culture of the whole world, especially in the culture of young people, which is the culture of the world, that of the young people. In other words, that charity is not normal. In fact, the service, if it's an American school, I mean, you do voluntary work, but charity as such, charity as you have described, is no longer considered as normal. And I'd like to ask you, please, with the Knights of Columbus, what actually helps you to be educated to this gesture, which of course has to spring naturally from the person and can't spring from an organization. It has to be a personal gesture, otherwise it's not charity. So what is it in your lives, in your association, that helps the members to be educated to this charitable act? I mean, what makes it spring forth?
Thank you. Very good questions. I think one of the situations for an organization like the Knights of Columbus
per un'organizzazione tipo i Cavalieri di Colombo,
that has been in existence for 125 years
più anni,
is to look at the great renewal that is going on in the church today,
osservare anche il grande rinnovamento che ha luogo nella Chiesa oggi,
which communion and liberation is a wonderful example.
liberazione veramente un esempio meraviglioso.
And to internalize and participate
Bisogna internalizzare, interiorizzare, partecipare
in this renewal of the church
a questo processo di rinnovamento della Chiesa.
and what it means to be a Christian today in this society, in this culture. Secondly, we are all living in a culture in the West which is increasingly secularized. Europe perhaps a little bit faster than the United States. But unfortunately, we're working very hard to catch up. The mission, it seems to me, of Pope Benedict, as seen in his 3 encyclicals, is to help Christians to recover a Christian way of thinking in an environment which has an oppressive secular way of conceptualizing. So Deus Caritas Est is not about social work, it's about loving people. It's about understanding our neighbor as our family. And what mother or father is happy when someone in a child in the family goes to bed hungry? This is a Christian way of thinking. It's not a secular way of thinking. Spe Salve is about what it means to have hope rather than a psychological optimism or a faith in automatic progress or a material evolution. And what does it mean in Caritas and Veritate to speak of the sincere gift of self in the context of the practical everyday life that we find ourselves in the business world, in the marketplace? So, if we are in the springtime of the gospel, then we need to recover what it means to be uniquely Christian. What is it that the event of Christ brings that is new? Benedict writes in Spe Salve that people who have hope live differently. So in what way do we see that a Christian is different? So this is the great challenge. It presents itself in a concrete way in the United States, which is a young society, and it presents itself in Europe in a society which has a longer tradition of Christianity. And in some ways, I think in Europe it's much harder. So I think the worst thing that we can do is to embrace the status quo
abbracciare, accettare lo status quo
in a very conservative way
e adottare un atteggiamento conservatore
and watch a great miracle, which is the renewal of the church,
e guardare, osservando un miracolo nuovo, quale è il rinnovamento della Chiesa,
pass us by because we are self-satisfied.
che ci passa davanti e lo lasciamo passare semplicemente perché siamo già soddisfatti.
Thank you. Grazie.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I would like to ask a second question. You have talked about the civilization of love, and you also have written a book on this subject. Now, in what way, please, do you see, or in other words, how can the Knights of Columbus and all of us Catholics, how can we all participate in this new evangelization? In other words, what can we do? How can we announce? I mean, like an American businessman, for example. I mean, how can he, for example, participate and be part of this new announcement of a civilization of life? How can he go about it? Because, I mean, why am I asking this? Because I think that a civilization of love is more than just an ethical society.
You're not asking very simple questions. Well, I go back to the earlier question, Deus caritas est, God is love. To understand this really in the most profound way, when we look at the Christian message, when we read in St. Paul, nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. And we look at the crucifix, one of the most painful ways of dying. So, we can torture him, we can kill him, but nothing we can do can separate us from his love. That's the Christian message. And then to try to love our neighbor as he loves us. Now, this is not an ethical imperative. This is something much more profound. Right? And so if we can grasp this, like the mustard seed, and maybe it's only possible that we can grasp a little bit. But if we do that, then everything changes. And if one is in business, how do you sell a product you would not buy? Or sell it for a price that you would not pay? Or pay a salary that you would not work for? So all of these things are a matter of justice. But what makes justice possible is love of neighbor. Now, this is the Christian inheritance. But in the secular society, we've forgotten this.
In una società secolarizzata abbiamo dimenticato tutto questo.
So it is up to us in some way to witness to this.
Dipende da noi, in un certo qual modo, dare testimonianza di questo.
And I think this is what John Paul II means
Questo sia anche il significato di ciò che ci dice Giovanni Paolo II.
when he writes in Familiaris Consortio that man is created out of love. He is created for love. And his life is unintelligible when it is separated from love. So the vocation of every person, the meaning of every person, is a vocation to love. And the only understanding which is consistent with the great dignity of the person is this vocation to love. And the only place we see that vocation revealed is at the crucifixion. And so what interpretation compares with this? Whether politically or economically or socially or philosophically. And so the nihilism of postmodern culture has created a great vacuum of what it means to be a person. And into this vacuum is the gospel. So even though the nihilism of contemporary culture is so oppressive, it at the same time opens up the kind of opportunity that perhaps the church has not had since Constantine and St. Augustine. And so if you take the commandment to love one's neighbor, is this a real commandment or is it just an idealism? If it is a real commandment, then what other civilization is worthy of the human person but the civilization of love and the culture of life? Okay.
I'm going to keep you on the spot. Una domanda adesso da America.
Okay, a question to another fellow American. You have talked about the fact that you have chosen a Catholic hero, Christopher Columbus. And yesterday, I had the privilege of chairing a meeting with Professor Weiler, who talked about the educational experience in America. And he talked about this from the Jewish standpoint. Now, Professor Weiler and his brothers are fully aware that it's a challenge to transmit a Jewish consciousness in the United States. He sees it as a challenge, and he very openly, frankly said, more than 90% of U.S. Jews don't really try and are not seeking to follow their culture, follow their religious tenets. And in the United States, we see very often that one is first of all an American and then a Catholic. And so with this great fraternity of Catholics that does exist, however, how do you see the possibility of helping Catholic Americans to live out and to take up and take within themselves this faith that they have, this gift of faith? I mean, okay, you got the question?
I think first, we have to understand that good catechesis it is necessary to have a strong doctrinal formation. But that is not sufficient, because unless it is internalized and lived, it remains an abstraction. So the answer to the Christian life must be more than the articulation of doctrine and the articulation of an ethical position. It's got to be a lived, concrete experience that confronts daily challenges. And so when Mother Teresa says, it is a great poverty that a child should die, that a person may live the way he or she wants to live, there is a credibility there because of the way she experiences the Christian life. And so that communal experience, that community experience, has to be more than simply a cultural tradition. It has to be an active reality. And one of the ways I think Catholics in the United States, we have to stop being embarrassed and realize that we have a and we have the responsibility to evangelize culture. To evangelize American culture. And this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone attends a Catholic church, or we only vote for Catholics for office. But the ideals to which the society is directed, the goal, maybe what the philosopher would say, the teleology, should be of fundamental Catholic values and principles. Christ is above every culture, drawing every culture to himself. And so I think the Jews have understood the danger of living in a ghetto. And Catholics must not make the same
I
mistake.
cattolici non devono però commettere lo stesso errore.
Thank you very much.
Personalmente sono stato
Well, personally, I was struck by three things that came out in this presentation and in the debate. First of all, one of the three things was your insistence on the need to look, to gaze upon and to see the miracles that are actually happening now in the church. This sort of clarity is not found everywhere. I mean, we have to look and see the miracles that are happening here and now within the church. And this struck me very much. And the second thing that I was struck by was at the end of the day, the miracles, what do these tell us? I mean, why do they happen? They happen to transmit one particular thing and make clear one particular thing, i.e. Love for me, that he has for me. And seeing this love, and only by seeing this love, I am changed. And when I understand that change is possible within me, I understand then that the world can change. And this is something which is quite spectacular, and I'd like to thank you very, very much for pointing this out. The third thing that I was struck by was that this change, if it is true, in fact touches everything, absolutely everything. In other words, to use a simple and rather silly example, but as I'm a teacher, I think I'd like to mention this. I mean, if I lose my hand, my whole life changes. If I am without a hand, I mean, my whole life changes if I don't have a hand. Everything in my life changes because I don't have a hand any longer. And therefore, if this change comes about, well, all my life is changed, and therefore all culture is thereby affected. And this is what a Christian bears within him, a Christian who is aware and knowledgeable of this love, because he looks at the event of love. So I'd like to thank you very, very much as a friend and as somebody who would always like to follow you. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of all the friends of the meeting. Thank you sincerely.
so glad that you're here with us. So glad.